We now move on to Mrs. Shiva Dustdar, who is from the European Investment Bank, where she's in the Innovation Finance Department. So over to you.
Thank you very much to have me here. As we heard earlier, bankers are not perhaps the likely people to come to a conference like this, but I do hope that we are now maybe opening such fora for such, and I'm perhaps then not the first banker, but hopefully in future events there will be more. So I'm very delighted to be here. I will today give you perhaps a complementary perspective to what Robert Jan gave you and build on what Professor Schutte said in terms of what the EIB is doing together with the European Commission under Horizon 2020, and give you perhaps a taste for something that could maybe be a potential area of collaboration with the philanthropic community. So this is just some food for thought at this stage. Before maybe starting, just very briefly, I hope everybody knows who the EIB is, what the EIB stands for. We are your bank, the Bank of the European Union. So I will, not go into much detail, but you should hopefully all feel that this is the bank that is serving your interests as citizens. We are operating in all the member states and, of course, beyond that. So we are a bank and an institution, and this is perhaps where we are wearing different hats, but also have learned over time to make sure that we are acting as a bank in the interest of the EU policy, and therefore have to always find that right balance that also I think the philanthropic community is trying to sort of strive for. Now, as a bank, we obviously give money. We give money to people who need the money, but of course we also like to give money to people who don't need maybe the money, because that's what keeps our portfolio also in good standing. But this is obviously the primary function, and so that's the lending. You may have heard of the word blending, and this is perhaps the area that we will later zoom in. So blending, now this is where we experimented with the European Commission, something that may actually be a very interesting footprint, or blueprint, sorry, I should say, for future collaboration, maybe with also the philanthropic community. What we are talking about here is using some of the grant funding that is available as risk buffer to allow the bank to take more risk, go further, but nevertheless remain for its own business model to operate within certain prudential limits, and hence go the extra mile without necessarily jeopardizing its own standing, financially. So this is the blending, and I'll tell you a bit later how we are doing that on the innovation side, because that actually has been a very important flagship program that I believe, is now sort of bearing its fruits in a much wider scale. So that is the blending. Now, the area that I'm responsible or that I'm working in is on the advisory side, and this is perhaps also for this forum the interesting area, because in advisory we are, looking at ways to help projects to become ready for financing, and we're also the area that is constantly looking to new ways of doing things, and perhaps also for such an audience, this is the given that we don't have maybe something concrete to discuss for financing, this is the area that can actually be very relevant for this community. Now, I will very briefly just sort of refer to this famous Juncker package, or the European Fund for Strategic Investments that you may have heard of. And on the advisory side, there is a hub, sort of a gateway that allows basically anybody who may have some important project that they would like to see whether it could be financed under this FC. This is a gateway where these ideas can be coming in and screened and then directed to either within the EIB or within the network of partners to the right place. So the reason I'm referring to this is because there may be people in the audience who would like to take advantage of this hub, and you're certainly welcome to do so. Now, within this hub, and also perhaps as part of what I mentioned earlier, as part of this Horizon 2020 program, we have this InnovFin program. You may have heard of it, I don't know, it is, I would hope, Robert Young would agree, it is maybe monetarily not featuring in a big line item for the budget, from a budgetary perspective of Horizon 2020 over 7 years, but it actually has a high leverage effect and definitely a very high multiplier effect, meaning that this is where already under FP7 the bank and the European Commission piloted, experimented with the idea of, that I mentioned earlier, the blending. How can we have grants go further? Is there a way to use this, it's just a small portion of these grants, put them into a, into a financial instrument, a revolving type of instrument that then allows the EIB to have that risk protection and take more risk, financial risk, in particular, go into areas, into innovative projects that may be smaller, maybe have technological, scientific, regulatory risks that we would not have gone before, and with that actually bring in additional private sector investment along, bring in additional financial resources. So it has a very catalytic effect, it's meant to have a very catalytic effect, and it's meant to really go the extra mile that perhaps we weren't able to do before that. Now, what is very interesting in this is that we experimented that under FP7. We now have a bigger program, we have learned our lessons, we've taken, you see a lot of different colors, we've taken an approach to segment the market by size, in the one hand, like SMEs, mid-caps, large caps, because innovation happens, of course, across all of these entities. And we also have realized, and I will come back to it later, that there are in certain areas, perhaps we need to have thematic finance, we need to go again, look and innovate how we finance innovation. So that's in the orange box. And the additional thing we've also learned from FP7 is it is not just enough to have the money made available, but very often you need to also advise the counterparties how to access that funding, because it may not be so obvious. Maybe the project is not yet bankable, so there's certainly a lot of advisory support that could help these funds to become more accessible. So that's the advisory, and that's the area that I'm responsible for. So I'm going to give you a bit of background what advisory does to lead into maybe some of the ideas that we could further explore with the philanthropic community. So on the advisory side, as I mentioned, we have the project advisor, meaning helping a particular promoter project to become bankable. So they're not ready yet to access some of the funding. And here we basically, once there are certain eligibility checklists met as part of this partnership agreement with the European Commission under Horizon 2020, we then can support a particular promoter with this financial advice. So this is to really help them, direct them where the best source of funding may be. Is it ready for potential bank financing, or a loan, debt financing under these InnovFin products, or should there be maybe other type of financing that should come in before that? So this is very much sort of a financial but strategic advice. I would say it's not giving you the sort of advice that a consultant would give you in a perhaps much broader base, but really sort of hopefully that last mile to help a project become ready for due diligence. Now, so this could be something that and we have not had yet a philanthropic organization per se benefit from it, but I will tell you about a project where already we've had some indirect benefits to the philanthropic community come through project advisory. Now, horizontal activities are sort of broader, where we're looking thematically at areas, and I'm going to actually give you just sort of that perspective in this puzzle. You see a lot of acronyms, and I'm sorry for some of that jargon. So let me give you perhaps the acronym of IDFF. So that's standing for Infectious Diseases Finance Facility. I don't know if anybody guessed it, but that's what it stands for. We've heard a lot of that in different acronyms used by the previous speaker. There are a lot of diseases that fall under infectious diseases like tuberculosis, malaria, and so on. So this is the area where, for instance, where we have had actually some contact with the philanthropic community. But we are also, I think, in other areas, in the horizontal activities, what we do is we try to better understand whether there are bottlenecks in terms of access to finance that, across various segments, the smaller companies, the larger companies, that our current financial instruments are not yet, or our instruments, but also generally that are sort of persisting. And based on those studies, we then make recommendations which we hope to make our instruments again better fit for purpose. So this is in many of these areas we come with very interesting various recommendations, but we also see some common themes. One of the common themes which I believe for this community could be very interesting came out of a study for key enabling technologies, CATS, which was that there is a real problem of knowledge gap between the high-tech companies that sort of fall into this categorization of CATS and the financial community. So one way to express it was, we need to find a way to bring science into finance and finance into science. Because what happens is that, especially with disruptive technologies, you have immediately within the perhaps financial community that may not, investors who may not understand the technology, a reaction of risk aversion. So the new technology may not be understood and therefore is risky. Perhaps underestimating that maybe that new technology is actually, reducing the risk of a legacy technology going against them. So there is not this full understanding of what a technology could translate into in terms of revenues, and with all of that comes a risk aversion. Now so we basically are looking for how can we bring in better science into the financial community. You have on the other side very often the scientific or the entrepreneurs, those with the great ideas, not able to express their great ideas in a way that the financial community understands in their own way. And of course, and this is where, for instance, our advisory service is already doing part of that translation work or helping, to get the story right so that the financial community understands it. So this is where really we are hoping that with the help of the European Commission and other stakeholders, we see how we can bridge some of that knowledge gap, maybe setting up expert pools. So there are a lot of ideas that are right now being considered. And perhaps this is also where the philanthropic community has a lot of latent expertise that could maybe also come into this to help basically both sides to understand each other. Now, on this IDFF, the Infectious Disease Financing Facility, what happened there is quite interesting because we started with an assignment in the TB vaccine area. You may have heard of TBVI. In fact, they are based in the Netherlands. I guess it's an NGO or product development entity that basically brings the TB vaccine community sort of together. They have a partner in the US called ERAS, so you may have heard of them. Now, they were looking at ways to finance, to get maybe also funding from the European Investment Bank, and it wasn't clear to them how to approach it, so it came into this advisory area, and I will tell you a little bit about later what we did. Now, out of that assignment, we then understood that TB vaccines is not the only area where financing challenges are persisting, that perhaps it is a wider issue, more systemic across infectious diseases. So that turned into a horizontal assignment for our area. We looked at what it is that sort of, why are our own financial instruments not fit for purpose, what's happening, where is the risk-return dynamic. And out of that study came a recommendation to perhaps look at a new financial instrument set under this InnovFin program. So that was one of the orange boxes, which then got launched. So this is sort of to give you a sense of how our advisory kind of feeds into then new ways of financing projects. So maybe to give you an initial start, the advisory role started with, in fact, being an advisor to the European Commission to DG RTD, to Robert Jan Smith's team of, on the health side. We were basically brought in to see how the European Commission, together with the European Investment Bank, could work in partnership with, in fact, the Gates Foundation and others, in particular member states that were very actively already financing TB, in fact, the Netherlands being one of them, how we could bring in perhaps some of the framework around that would allow us to understand the dynamic of how funding goes into these primarily grant funding goes into these projects, and how we could perhaps use some of the financial discipline, the technology, the engineering to perhaps enable more funding to go in. So there was a very open-minded approach. We were perhaps initially a bit optimistic that we could create portfolios and do all sorts of things, but we realized that for the TB vaccines, it was actually, the problem was was such that it was not ready for really the standard financial techniques to come in. And out of this very hands-on discussions, which took obviously a while, but which got us to know the wider global health community, especially on also the way that philanthropy, sort of the psychology of some of the donors, the member states, but also philanthropists, the whole notion of alignment of interest, the challenges, you mentioned autonomy, all of these things became very, very visible to us as an advisor, trying to bring these parties together. We decided that instead of bringing financial engineering into this, given all of these various interests at work, it was perhaps better to take the problem not at the TB vaccine level, but at, as I mentioned, at a more systemic level, because we realized that there are actually a lot of parallels, and that while we were talking to TB vaccine people, we had malaria vaccine people come to us and say, why are you speaking to only TB vaccine? We have similar issues on malaria vaccines, and HIV people came, and we realized that it's of no use to have now fragmented approaches if in fact we're talking of very similar issues from a financial perspective. So out of that realization, we then had a horizontal activity, as to put it sort of in our language, to look, and this was again at the request of DG RTD, to look at this infectious disease area in a more systematic way and see whether there was a case for additional public support intervention by the European Union. This was actually a very useful exercise for us as a bank because we got to learn a bit sort of the dynamic of how the European Union is financing a lot of these areas, and also had, as part of this exercise, to understand the private sector, the psychology of the pharmaceutical companies, the psychology of these product development companies that were sort of somewhere in between the private and the public sector research institutions, and then see how this funding, sort of, the psychology of the funding, and how, what there is that we need to perhaps, do better. Out of that came basically an assessment of the challenges, and you see sort of, this valley of death, which kind of, very often in financial circles you hear. I think what really became quite clear to us is that, especially for these infectious diseases, as also some of the speakers mentioned earlier, you have a dynamic where the risk return is out of sync. Perhaps unlike oncology or maybe some of the, I don't want to say lucrative diseases, but some of them that have better maybe return prospects, here we were dealing, in the case of TB, malaria, with very often disease areas that have, of course, big markets in the developing countries, and therefore, the scientific risk levels are very high, and this risk return made them very difficult to be funded only in the private, through private mechanisms. So this, and we then looked, of course, at our own sort of how grants are coming into it, and also realized that perhaps the challenge is so high in terms of so many disease areas that certainly on an EU basis, the grants are not sufficient. I mean, obviously with austerity and so many other things, perhaps there are ways we can leverage or have these grants go further. Now this then came, we basically use our experience that we had gained, the one that I mentioned to you under InnovFin, of blending grants with our own capital, but had to, of course, be very aware that the risks were much higher, and the previous speaker expressed it in a very good way. So basically, grants right now, you have 100% of loss, because once they're out the door, you never see that money. So it was it was really starting with that as a starting point. And then looking, okay, how do we now perhaps improve the potential of getting the money back, but that needs to be better understood, and develop a financial instrument that has a rather high sort of risk buffer, much higher than what we had in our prior programs, just because, first of all, it is an area that we knew has been so far primarily grant funded, but we were trying to see how much can we kind of get some reflow into the system so that, in fact, your money goes further. So this risk sharing between the bank and the commission had to be sorted out. We decided to pilot it just between us, because now we know how we are both on both sides ticking, but we were also aware that if this mechanism bears fruit, and if we have a successful pilot, perhaps it is something that can be scaled up with third-party funding, and this was certainly always in the back of our mind. I don't want to go into the details of it, but effectively this IDFF is financing clinical trials of infectious diseases. It is pretty broad-based in its intervention. That means that it has it has vaccines, devices, drugs, and currently basically has a commitment of, with certain conditions, of up to 200 million. But 200 million is actually a drop in the ocean if you think of how much actually needs to flow into this disease area. It has so far funded 2 projects or 2 companies, one like a pre-revenue startup, Cavidi, which produces HIV diagnostics in Sweden, I believe. And the other one is Transgen, Institut Mérieux, and it's sort of a portfolio of infectious diseases, I believe vaccines and drugs. Now, there's a pipeline that is, right now being reviewed that is over 110 million in size. So as you can see, if these projects get signed in the next year or 2, the facility may indeed run out of funding, and given that reflows may not come in exactly when you need the money, there is an idea of seeing how we can scale it up. The scale up could come from through this Juncker initiative. I mean, that's being, of course, explored, but it could also attract other like-minded investors. And here is where I would perhaps cautiously also say perhaps the philanthropic community. I mean, this is where one has to explore and see whether these are areas where there is sufficient alignment of interest, and it is through the advisory area of the bank where such ideas are basically explored. So I would like to leave you with perhaps here a more concrete situation that we are working on. But the main idea is that through the advisory, we actually can explore many different ways of collaboration. And also, if you as a philanthropic organization would actually like to be the beneficiary of the advice, I understand that with the Commission we could see whether that could also be explored. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shiva. Just one question from me and maybe one from the floor. If you're a foundation that wants to come to you with an idea for collaboration, what are you looking for and how should they approach you?
So, I mean, this of course, the best way usually is to actually give it a try, and then we see whether it actually is something we can help you. So I would not wish to, we're very open-minded. We have certain competencies, and as I mentioned, are primarily on the financial side. We really build on the competencies of the European Commission, certainly on the scientific side and also elsewhere. So, I would say the best thing is to give it a try. I have my card, which I can share with you. But clearly there has to be an innovation angle, fit with Horizon 2020 objectives, and a need for funding. And I would say the need for funding at this stage for our program is at the minimum level of 7.5 million. This sounds now a bit precise for you, but this is the amount for direct EIB intervention. So if those conditions are met, it could be a first starting point.